Hey nerds, what's up? Today we're going to talk about diverse representation in fantasy media and whether or not it's important. Now, obviously, representation can mean a number of things, namely race, sexual orientation, gender identities, age, body size, bodily or cognitive differences, but I don't think it's going to be any surprise to anyone today that the particular representation I want to focus on for fantasy adaptations is racial diversity. I am sure this discussion has been going on for ages, but in my personal lifetime with engaging with fandoms online, it seems like these conversations have really risen, in particular starting with John Boyega's portrayal of Finn in the Star Wars franchise, and then even more so with the release of the Wheel of Time adaptations and most recently the Rings of Power adaptation. The discussions about race in these fantasy settings are often very frustrating and upsetting to me, and so today I would like to bring research into the conversation. I want to talk about how research shows that diverse representation in media does matter and why it matters. I want to have a frank discussion about when race matters to a character and when it doesn't matter to a character. I want to talk about authorial intent and why we are worried about that when we talk about fantasy adaptations. And finally, I do want to talk about times where there may be legitimate criticism about racial diversity and what that would look like. So yeah, we're getting into some big topics today. See you after the jump. If you've been at my channel for a while, you will know that I am always all about the research. There is a great organization called the Representation Project that gathers information and data on the current state of representation in media, particularly in television and film. They compare representation in the biggest and most popular media to the actual percentages of those demographics in the United States. For example, with a population of 51% female, we would expect female representation in media to be roughly the same. It's often not. But we are focusing on race today, and the research shows that for the first time ever, BIPOC characters in 2021 were represented in parity with the US population. Despite this, time focused on those characters are still half as much as white counterparts, and only 9% of Oscar winners for Best Picture have BIPOC leads. I find that very interesting, but that really only gives us a view of what representation looks like today. It doesn't really talk about whether or not it matters, it's just the current state of things. Now, when we want to dig into research about why or how or if representation matters, a lot of the research focuses on children's media. Now, I think that makes sense because we often view children or young adults as the people who are going through the most forming of their identity and discovering who they are. And guess what? Research has shown that lack of representation or negative representation of underrepresented identities does have an actual measurable effect on those from the same populations that are underrepresented. One of the most interesting studies to me was a study that looked at the self-esteem of elementary school-aged children over long-term TV and film exposure. It showed a lowering of self-esteem for both white and black girls and black boys, but an increase of self-esteem for white boys. I don't think I really need to elaborate there. If we move on to adults viewing media, one of the most interesting studies I found talked about how the smallest of biases can be read and influence viewers. As the abstract succinctly describes, characters on 11 popular television shows exhibited more negative nonverbal behavior toward black than toward status-matched white characters. Critically, exposure to pro-white versus pro-black nonverbal biases increased viewers' bias even though patterns of nonverbal behavior could not be consciously reported. These findings suggest that hidden patterns of televised nonverbal behavior influence bias among viewers. In other words, nonverbal things like, for example, all the villains being BIPOC and all the heroes being white actually do have a measurable effect on viewers in a negative way towards those stereotypes and those groups of people. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Research upon research upon research shows that the way that people and identities are represented in media have an effect on how we feel about those identities and also affect the self-esteem of people who hold those identities. Media influences our life. It is not a vacuum. There are measurable learned behaviors based on how we see identities represented on screen. The research shows this. And the data also shows that we aren't being overrun by BIPOC characters. In fact, for the first time ever, we've actually just sort of matched the actual percentage in the United States of BIPOC people. Now, of course, we're talking about fantasy worlds, and fantasy worlds is not just a fantasy continent. Many of these fantasy worlds we talk about have rich cultures on multiple continents. And if we go outside of the United States and look at worldwide data of non-white people, just taking a look at these statistics, who do you think is the overrepresented race here? Okay, so that's the research on why representation matters, but let's actually move on to talk about the characters themselves. A lot of times my gut reaction when people have started complaining about race in these fantasy adaptations before the adaptation even comes out is like, oh my gosh, who cares? Why are we making such a big deal about this? Now, of course, my last section shows we should be making a big deal in the right way about it because representation does matter. When I usually express that, what I mean is a lot of the times the race of a character doesn't matter for that character themselves, so I don't understand why people are so upset about it. I kind of start wondering, like, why do they care about this particular character so much looking like their headcanon? Why does it matter so much to them? So I hope you'll bear with me. I would like to do a few case studies with adaptations that have come out recently and talk about this phenomenon within these case studies. So the first one I want to start with is the Wheel of Time. If you're a big Wheel of Time fan, you read the books, I want you to conjure up the descriptions of characters in the novel. But particularly, I want you to think about character descriptions that were specifically important to the plot or the events in some way. So not characters that were described a lot or described in a certain way a lot, but characters whose looks description mattered a lot to the plot itself. The first and foremost person that immediately comes to mind in the Wheel of Time is obviously Rand al'Thor. Rand al'Thor's looks get mentioned a lot and later become a very important plot point and an important indicator of events that happen later in the story. And one thing I noticed is in the TV adaptation, they kept Rand al'Thor very directly looking like he looked in the book, which made sense because it was a very important look to the story. And in fact, by making a lot of the characters in the Two Rivers BIPOC that maybe weren't necessarily described as that in the book, it only served to emphasize Rand's otherness in a way that actually served the story rather than detracted from it. In other words, how did making the show more diverse take anything away from the book? In this case, the individuals they chose to do that with, it didn't matter to the overall scale of the book, and so I think they chose very good characters in order to bring a little bit more representation into the novels. A great example is Nynaeve. If Nynaeve didn't have a braid, we'd have a serious issue, but Nynaeve still had a braid, and that was the most important physical aspect of her character, and it was maintained. Let's move on to talking about Rings of Power. One thing I found extremely fascinating about the diversity inclusion in Rings of Power is that they were almost exclusively given to non-canonical characters. It's almost as if the showrunners were trying to be maybe careful of how really longtime Tolkien fans may view canonical characters, that they had very specific visions for how they looked in their head, and instead of messing with that, they just added diversity with their non-canonical characters that it would have been impossible for anyone to have a preconceived notion of. I think Miriel is the only canonical character in which she distinctly does not fit the book description. Her biography page is tiny on the fandom wiki, and more than half of it, despite that, is actually about her husband. So you're really telling me she's your favorite character and you had a very, very deep connection to how she looked and how she was described? Honestly, I think if there's any criticism here with the Rings of Power is that there actually should be more representation, more black elves, more black dwarves. As it is now, it's kind of weird that they're just in isolation, and we should maybe broaden out the population and have more diversity, at least in the background. For my second to last case study, I want to break a little bit and go with Disney and the new Little Mermaid adaptation, which isn't even out yet. Tell me, if I asked you what the most distinct feature of Ariel in the Disney's version is, what would you say? It's obviously her red hair. And guess what? In the new adaptation, she still has red hair. This current uproar has been particularly baffling to me because The Little Mermaid talks about mermaids, like a fictional thing that does not exist in a fictional undersea world that also does not exist, and yet we're trying to pretend that it has tons of European ties. Yes, I understand Hans Christian Andersen was European, but have you guys read The Real Little Mermaid? Because I did. I read it this year or last year, I can't remember. And the Disney version changes a lot, okay? It changes a lot. So if we're gonna quibble about it not being like Hans Christian Andersen, we've got a lot of other stacks before having a black Little Mermaid. And honestly, so many of these fairy tales are just so far removed from the European origins, I just find this criticism extremely silly. In fact, We've been playing with race on these classic fairy tales for a long time. You know, when the Brandy Cinderella came out, I only remember a lot of excitement. Of course, the internet wasn't as big of a thing when that came out. I was also very young, so maybe I just didn't know about the uproar. But as far as I know now, that Brandy Cinderella is iconic. Most people have very fond memories of it. And let me tell you, if there's any adaptation that plays fast and loose with race, it's that one. And it just didn't matter because it's a fairy tale. Because nothing about Cinderella is based in Europeanness. When we think of some of the Disney movies that clearly have ties, you might think of Mulan, for example, where China is an actual part of the plot. But for things like Cinderella and the Little Mermaid and things like that, there really is no tie to any European countries. So this sort of race discussion just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Okay. Please bear with me as we go through our last case study, which is going to actually be Harry Potter, in which we remove race from the conversation for a moment to illustrate a point. The Phelps twins do not look at all like the Weasley twins described in Harry Potter. They are described as the shortest of the Weasley brothers and stocky. Neither James nor Oliver Phelps fits that at all, in fact coming in as the tallest of the Weasley brothers in the movie adaptation and quite lanky. I just don't remember a single uproar over this. Maybe there were a few comments about it, I think I remember reading that, but no one was wildly upset about this. And then when everyone went and saw the movies and saw that James and Oliver Phelps are about as perfection in that role as possible, we embraced it full-heartedly. In fact, embraced it so much that I tend to see fan art showing Phelps twins more than the actual descriptions of the twins in the book because they so embody that character. I think for most of us, we just envision them now, even when we read the novels. So how come it seems that people tend to give casting the benefit of the doubt when race is removed? When it's a different hair color, we tend to be okay, well, I'll wait and see. That's not how I imagine the character, but maybe I'll see if they pull it off. But then somehow when race gets involved, there's an immediate uproar with absolutely no ability to wait and see how they may embody the character. And when that happens, yes, it is very hard for me not to question the intention of those claims, of the claims that I'm not racist, it's just not canon. So some of you might be saying at this point, well, it's not fair though. They turn white characters black or other races all the time, but they would never dare turn a black character white, so that's not fair. Except, yeah, they actually do that all the time. If we want to use real racist examples, we could go back to Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's. But even if we don't use the examples of that, which happened quite often, we can use more recent fantasy examples. And just off the top of my head, I think of the movie The Last Airbender. We can look at Jake Gyllenhaal in The Prince of Persia. We can look to Tilda Swinton as the Ancient One, or Scarlett Johansson in Ghost in the Shell. And I'm sure the list just goes on and on and on. Okay, so then you might say, yeah, but people were angry over those. And so that's not fair because they don't get angry over these other ones. However, the idea that we can divorce this conversation from actual history just feels very disingenuous to me. We know world history. We know about colonialism and slavery and internment camps. And we know which way it swung, and we know the historical history of the erasure of BIPOC characters. An erasure that just has never happened to white characters. The data shows it. And so the differences of these two things, they're not equal, they're not the same, and we can't pretend they are. Let's move on to one of the last topics I want to cover around this area, which is authorial intent and what it means in terms of race switching in fantasy adaptations. A lot of conversations I see recently about this, particularly with Wheel of Times and definitely with Rings of Power, is, well, this is against the author's wishes. This isn't what the author wrote, this isn't what the intent was, and so it is bad, it is wrong, and we should not do it. They'd be rolling in their graves right now if they saw this adaptation. But the truth of the matter is, maybe as fun as it is to speculate or think about those things, we do not know that. We can never know that. For people like Robert Jordan and J.R.R. Tolkien, who have passed on, we do not know how they would feel. As much as you'd like to guess, nobody can know. I think of Tolkien in particular, since that's, I think, the one that people claim about it the most, since his fans are so into his intentions and lore. And the dude died in the 1970s and wrote these in the 1950s. And you're telling me that there is absolutely no chance that Tolkien today, if he had been living, would maybe reevaluate the way he wrote race? Or reevaluate his entire cast of white characters? Me, in my little over 3 decades of life, have had many opinions change based on growing up, on new experiences, on history, and on data, and just living in this world. And the idea that someone who died, what is that now? 50 years ago, would have no change of opinion is baffling. And yes, we do know that Tolkien's original idea, I believe, was to write European mythology, and that was a part of it. But when we talk about our new adaptations and how we're moving with it, like the idea that we are for sure that Tolkien would have been rolling over his grave over adding diversity, it's a tough one for me to swallow, to be honest. And yeah, I don't know, but that's the point. We don't know the author's intent when they've died that long ago. Okay. A couple last important things. Representation in us. I am not saying that we can only be connected to characters that look like us. Obviously not. There are many times that we connect to characters that have very different identities than we do. But the data shows that it's also very important that we feel represented by people who do look like us and act like us and are like us. Now, I don't want to not include legitimate criticisms that may arise in this area, okay? There are criticisms about the way that diversity is used that I think can be beneficial, that can make adaptations better and even representation better. I talked about this a little bit in my video about female representation, about how if we're not allowed to criticize the way females are represented, then it's never gonna get better and we're not gonna have more solid characters. So this video is not to say that we can never criticize the way race is represented in fantasy adaptations or the way it's included or changed. Of course not. I think there are many legitimate criticisms. One I could think of off the top of my head is people have been scratching their head a little bit at the casting for Aviendha in The Wheel of Time. Not because anyone, well, some people for the wrong reasons, but a few of us, like for me, who had zero problem with the diversity they added to the Wheel of Time cast and actually quite enjoyed it. Aviendha made me scratch my head a little bit because now in the show we have already established what the AL look like, and that is actually a very important plot point. And so now making the AL look different is a little confusing. Other valid criticisms may come from the fact that changing race in some stories could actually have an effect on the overall story. Race is not an exclusion in a vacuum normally and can come with legitimate experiences and baggage, just like I talked about in my gender switching video from switching men to female. There may be some things that come with that, and if it's not addressed, I think it's a valid criticism to say, hey, this needed to be addressed. This actually changes the character when you come with this more baggage or history behind it. And I think these are valid criticisms, and they can be talked about, again, with a maturity that doesn't become attacking people who have no control over the story. I think that is really the point. There are valid criticisms in this space, but those valid criticisms should never include racial slurs, death threats. Honestly, they should never really be attacking the actor or actress at all, in my opinion. We can have these discussions, but they should also be discussions that most likely happen after the adaptation's actually seen, so we actually know what's happening and not based on a single picture. All of these show mature and adult discussion behaviors that I think are often missing from the racial discussion of fantasy adaptations. I also covered it a little bit in my Toxic Fandoms video if you want to watch that. But yes, there are definitely creators and showrunners who are in a small portion of racist fan base to ignore all criticism against a show, which can also be extremely frustrating when criticism is legitimate and usually has nothing to do with race of the actors at all. So it is not that we cannot criticize these things or that there is not useful conversation around it. It is that usually the conversation that happens around it is inappropriate and is racist, to be clear. I also think it's very interesting, something that people may want to evaluate is why they don't get angry when a BIPOC character is changed to white, but those same people get angry when the opposite happens. If you're not angry about all of the lore changes, then again, it's something I think you need to question within yourself. So, does race matter in fantasy adaptations? The answer is yes. Yes, it does. Data and research shows that representation is very important for the self-esteem of people growing up and also for our own biases and the way we can treat people in real life. Being so-called lore purists when you wouldn't care over things like eye change or hair color change or height change, but race change feels specific and targeted. And having fantasy worlds that more fully represent the diversity of our actual world just makes sense. Let me know what you think on this very touchy subject. I know it's sometimes difficult to discuss, but I think it's a very important conversation to have. It can feel frustrating in the internet times where, as I discussed again in my Toxic Fandom video, where things are short and often lack nuance and the real heart of things. And this is definitely one of those topics that suffers from that. I truly think most fans understand that diversity is important, but I wanted to get this out here as a specific conversation starter so that we can talk about this sort of thing in a non-reactionary way, which is really the goal of my channel. So please let me know your thoughts below. I'd like to hear them. And as always, if you like these kind of deep dive videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.